One imagines that your experience with the controversies around the linguistics and legislation in Canada must have felt like one of those plunges into the depths on some level, would you say? Did you feel a sense of personal tragedy and fear and a concern about consequence, or that there may be no way back, that it could represent a kind of death? Or did it indeed represent a kind of death for you, for one for which you are subsequently grateful?
Well, I would say for the first 4 months, when the political scandal broke, it was very unsettling for a variety of reasons. The first was that my occupation as a clinical psychologist and as a professor was definitely in doubt. I mean, the university sent me 2 warning letters, and that's a standard HR procedure. Usually you get 3, right? The third warning is stop, or their consequences won't be good. If you work in human resources, you have to, especially if you're going to go after someone with tenure, you have to document their misbehavior. You have to provide them with warnings. You have to tell them how they could get back on the right track. And then if you have documented refusal to comply with the warnings, then they have grounds for dismissal. So we're very worried about that.
You were close to some kind of personal or professional annihilation, or certainly damage. Now, for people, just in case on the off chance that there are people that are unaware of the details, I'll say it as I understand it, and then you can tell me how I've got it wrong. The government changed the law saying that there are neutral nouns that mandatorily would be applied to people identified as transgender. You said that is an imposition on freedom of speech, whilst I would make a decision whether or not I would. If I was meeting a transgender person, I would talk to them how they wanted to be talked to. The fact that you're making it law is an impediment on the freedom of speech, and then it kicked off.
Yeah, that's a good summary of it. Yeah, I would say. I mean, my sense, there were 2 things I objected to. One was that the government, for the first time in the history of Canada, and really in a move that was unprecedented in English common law, under English common law, actually mandated the content of voluntary speech. And I thought, I don't care what your excuse is for doing that. That's no-go zone as far as I'm concerned. That's not happening.
Even though, right, this is what it seems to me like, sort of, help me to understand this, right? Because what I'm always interested in, I think, is power and where power is. Yeah. And, like, you know, I've subsequently looked at what your views are towards, like, sort of post-structuralist and the alt-left. And, like, a lot of things I think, yeah, you're right. That you know, I agree with that. But what the reason I think that the sort of the controversy had fuel on both sides, the reason it had an engine on the other side, is because it seems that, and indeed having watched other interviews and the objections that other interviewers have presented to you, it seems to me that a transgender person is in a position of vulnerability. But you're saying this is not about transgender. This is about language and it's about oppression. That's what you're saying.
Well, that was my claim, is that this wasn't about transgenderism at all, and I would
about
say,
which you got no strong view, I'm guessing, or
I don't have the sort of strong view that I would think I was sufficiently qualified to make political statements about.
Yeah, like Chappelle goes, I don't understand it, but it's not my...
Well, I basically look at the research, you know, and I mean, the research for transgendered kids is quite clear, is that most of them desist by the time they're 18. You know, and I'm basically guided by...
Where's this in, like, Scandinavia, where they check that stuff out?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now, people have criticized that research, like all research, but it's the best research that's been done on the topic. But the other problem was with the legislation was that I felt that it was an attempt by the radical left to gain the linguistic territory and to define the terms of the debate. You know, and I thought that was very dangerous. So I was objecting to that as well.
Feel you. Now, the thing that I'm interested in here, Jordan, is I don't feel like the radical left is a very powerful group. Am I being naive here? I mean, possibly in the world of academia, particularly, like, I feel like they are sort of representative of a coalition built around identity politics, issues that would seem particularly important to people. Like, my general view is, if you identify something, cool, no problem, it's none of my business. That's basically my opinion. I'll call you what you want me to call you. I'm happy that you're speaking to me. But do you see a sort of the sort of extreme left, or as a powerful organisation, like,
certainly in the universities.
So what they can get what done? They could, for example, they could get that legislation passed.
Yes, that. Well, and I think the situation is different in the US than it is in other countries. I think the political situation in the US is actually more balanced than it is in most Western countries, because I would say the left, the radical left, has a pretty decent hold on a number of institutions, and first and foremost of those would be the universities. But then the conservatives, aren't without power in the United States, because they occupy most of the elected positions now. But it's not the case in Canada.
Real time, Bill Maher's HBO show. The conversation about Islam that ensued created quite a bit of controversy. Harris said, among other things, that, quote, Islam at this moment is the motherlode of bad ideas, unquote. He went on to say that more than 20% of Muslims are either jihadists or Islamists who want to foist their religion on the rest of humanity. That comes out to about 300 million people. I beg to differ and said as much when I responded with my own thoughts on the show. But I wanted to talk to Mr. Harris in person, so here he is. He's the author of a new book, Waking Up, and we might get to it. Yes. But first I want to ask you about that number, which sure. It struck me you sort of pulled out of a hat. If you do have, something in the range of 20% of all Muslims who are either jihadists or Islamists, and which implies condoning violence and such, I'm just doing the math. That comes to about 300 million.
Right.
So there were 10,000 terrorist events last year. Let's assume that 100 people, let's assume all of those were Muslim. Let's assume each event was planned by 100 people. Neither of those assumptions is right, but I'm being generous.
Right.
That comes to about 1 million people who are jihadists. So that still leaves us with 299 million missing Muslim terrorists.
Right. Well, there are a few distinctions I think we have to make here. One is there's a difference between a jihadist and an Islamist. And there I was talking about Islamists and jihadists together. And so Islamists are people who want to foist their interpretation of Islam on the rest of society. And sometimes they have a revolutionary bent, sometimes they have a more of a normal political bent. But they do want to...
The fact that somebody may believe that, for example, Sharia should obtain and women's testimony should be worth half a man's in court,
right,
doesn't mean that they want to kill people. Right?
Well, no.
Those are two, being conservative and religious, which, by the way, is not my orientation at all, but it's different from wanting to kill people.
Yes, yeah. Well, we should, again, you have to parse this on specific points, like, do you favor killing apostates? Do you think adulterers should be killed? And even among Islamists, you'd find more subscribing to one versus the other, depending on the poll you trust. But I didn't just pull the number out of a hat. I mean, there's a group at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, that looked at 40 years of parliamentary elections in the Muslim world, literally every election that has occurred, and found that Islamists got 15% of the votes. So I would say that when if you take this number 15% who vote for Islamist parties, and then you look at the poll results on specific implementation of Sharia law. So do you want adulterers and thieves given the traditional punishments, or should apostates be killed? You never find the number, with very few exceptions, you never find the number as low as 15% voting in favor of those punishments. It's often 60%, depending on the society. So I believe nudging that up to something around 20% is still a conservative estimate of the percentage of Muslims worldwide who have values relating to human rights and free speech that are really in zero-sum contest with our own. And I just think we have to speak honestly about that.
Clearly, Islam has a problem today, but there have been periods when Islam was at the vanguard of modernity. It was the place that preserved Aristotle and preserved science. So if it was Islam that was the problem, how come it was okay then? In other words, that would suggest that it is the social and political conditions within Muslim societies, or the people now. In other words, clearly Islam has been compatible with peace and progress, and it is compatible with violence, I would argue, just like all religions.
Yeah, well, up to a point. I would say that specific ideas have specific consequences. And the idea of jihad is not a new one. It's not an invention of the 20th century. And many people are now spreading a very PC and sanitized history of religious conflict. Islam has been spread by the sword for over 1,000 years. And yes, there's been an intensification, and for obvious political reasons, of intolerance in the 20th century. But the idea that life for Christians and Jews as dhimmi under Muslim rulers for 1,000 years was good doesn't make any sense. And certainly life for Jews, when you, compare it to medieval Christendom, then, okay, it might.
But that was the main alternative. I mean, that's why when the Jews left Spain and were expelled, they went to the place that they thought was most hospitable to them, which was the Ottoman Empire, which was the Caliphate, right?
I criticize Christianity as much as anyone. I wrote a book, Letter to a Christian Nation, which is just a vilification of the history of Christianity, the influence of the beliefs in the modern world.
Having written that book, you would recognize that there are elements of Christianity that, as you point out in that book, are compatible with and celebrate slavery and violence and all these very, very backward attitudes. And yet there are times when Christianity represented that, and at times when it has represented peace and modernity.
Okay, but there's a few things we have to distinguish here. One is specific ideas have specific consequences. So when you ask why Jews aren't living out of Leviticus and Deuteronomy anymore, and they're not sanctioning genocide, they're not sanctioning killing people for working on the Sabbath, there are several answers to that question. One is that there's no Sanhedrin, but the fact that they don't have a Sanhedrin
Explain what a Sanhedrin is.
It's a consecrated body of elders in the community that can judge whether or not somebody should be killed for working on the Sabbath. So the details matter, and one of the details here is that a belief that in Islam that the one true faith has to conquer the world through jihad, essentially, and that free speech.
But jihad means different things to different people.
It does. I agree with you that we have to convince the Muslim world, or get the Muslim world to convince itself, that jihad really just means an inner spiritual struggle. That is the end game for civilization. Right. But the reality is, an honest reading of the text and an honest reading of Muslim history makes jihad look very much like holy war.
So in that sense, the problem is you and Osama bin Laden agree. Because after all, you're saying his interpretation of Islam is correct.
Well, his interpretation, this is the problem. His interpretation of Islam is very straightforward and honest, and you really have to split hairs and do some interpretive acrobatics in order to get it to look non-canonical.
But do you really think that the path to reforming Islam is to tell Muslims that their religion is the motherlode of bad ideas, that they should become atheists or symbolic followers, or nominal, I think was the word you used, nominal followers? I mean, do you really think that 1.6 billion devout Muslims are going to go, oh, damn, of course, Sam Harris is right, my religion is crap, and I should just abandon it?
No. Well, I slightly misspoke there. I didn't mean nominal followers in the sense that only Muslim atheists could reform the faith. What I meant is followers who don't take these specific dangerous beliefs very seriously and want to interpret jihad as an inner spiritual struggle as opposed to holy war.
But do you think you're helping them, or you're making it harder for them by as I said, adopting the Osama bin Laden interpretation?
I'll tell you who's making it harder for them. Liberals who deny the problem. I get emails every day from atheists and secularists living in the Muslim world who say, I can't
forget about others.
Well, I'm telling you. I'm telling you the only metric I have for that is I hear from people living in Pakistan, for instance, who say, if a liberal like you can't even speak honestly about the link between ideology and violence, what hope is there for me? I can't even tell my mother what I believe about God because I would be afraid of my own family or village killing me.
Sam Harris, thank you very much.